Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in the winter of 2022, and as winter now nears its end, I thought it was finally time to look back over what both sides had achieved over winter and where the physical and economic battlefields stood after more than a year of war. Both sides entered the winter with the ambition of moving the needle in their favour, as the war was waged with two interrelated but also somewhat distinct struggles. On one hand, there was the political and the economic, where Western sanctions targeting Russia were matched up against Russian energy warfare targeting the European economy and their will to support Ukraine. Bankers and spreadsheet warriors the world over went to work, while around the world defence industrial bases struggled with the rapidly expanded demand for, well, just about everything. That economic, industrial and political battle is probably going to be critical to the way the war in Ukraine plays out, and it's the side of the last year that I'm going to be looking at specifically today. But it's important primarily because it informs a very real military struggle playing out on the battlefields of Ukraine. They're in a brutal attritional struggle that tests men and materiel to their absolute limits. Both sides again went into winter hoping to turn the tide of battle in their favour. Now, as winter comes to an end and the muds returned, I wanted to look back and see what each accomplished. And in order to make that judgment, whether we're talking about the economic side of the war or the military one, we need to make some assumptions over both sides' objectives. War is not a game, it's not a sport, there's no internationally agreed rulebook that points out how you keep score. So one of the only ways to effectively judge the situation is to ask which side achieved their goals. And that, unfortunately, means making assumptions. For Russia, it appears its primary winter objectives were to break down Allied cohesion with its energy war against Europe. It was to undermine Ukrainian will and its capacity to resist using its strategic bombing campaign, and it was to achieve a series of military objectives, which we'll talk about next time, but with the key focus still being on taking the Donbass. For the West, the goal seemed to have been to wound the Russian economy and its war-making potential through sanctions and other means, to support Ukrainian force regeneration efforts, and militarily to both undermine Russian force regeneration and to set conditions for a future Ukrainian offensive. Today, I'll be talking about the economic, political, and industrial side of those objectives. With winter ending, I'm going to look at what the Russian energy war on Europe achieved, or rather, failed to achieve. I'll look at the state of Western Allied cohesion and support for Ukraine, the effect of sanctions on the Russian economy, the impact on Ukraine of strategic bombing, and close out with the really fun stuff, a look at war production in Ukraine, the West, and Russia, the barriers those efforts face, and what we might expect going forward. So let's start with a relatively easy one, the energy war and the threats that Europe would freeze over winter without supplies of Russian gas. When I first covered this topic about 6 months ago, tensions and concerns were at their height. Putin was threatening to leave Europe to, quote, freeze. Gazprom went so far as to release a video showing Europe basically frozen over like something out of a disaster movie, implying that without them, their customers were doomed to suffering and misery. A move, you could argue, that marked them as at least 5% more evil than your average utility company. The goals, commonly expressed on Russian state TV and through other fora, were to drive up prices in Europe to inflict economic damage, and in so doing build political pressure on European governments to fold to some of Russia's demands. And if there was a time that strategy was going to work, it was during the winter, where temperatures were at their coldest, the demand for gas was at its highest, and the consequences of people not being able to heat their homes would be the most dire. When I made that video 6 months ago, I highlighted that the European gas market had gone into shock. Prices had multiplied many times over from their pre-war levels, impacting government, business, and individuals. But I also highlighted the variety of measures that Europe was putting in place in response. And another 6 months on, it's truly incredible what has been accomplished. They attacked the problem from just about every direction. Norway and other European gas producers squeezed out additional production. Industry and private individuals were encouraged to make savings. And then some of the truly bizarre stuff started. A German government that included the Greens Party reactivated coal-fired generation capacity and agreed to extend the life of several nuclear reactors. LNG import infrastructure that would normally take years to put in place was assembled at record pace. Under ordinary circumstances, German bureaucracy can be pretty slow and plodding. But faced with the choice between economic disaster and expediting processes, they chose the latter and unlocked some of that traditional German efficiency. About halfway through winter, Germany was already opening its third new floating LNG import terminal for business. And it wasn't the only country making those sort of strides. Storages were very expensively filled, and every alternative energy generation method that was available was accelerated or put into service. It's almost a truism to say that wartime conditions make normally impossible policy positions possible, and that certainly held true in Europe over the last year. The same governments that signed off on relighting coal-fired generators also signed off on deploying renewable energy technologies across the European Union at breakneck pace. It mattered not from where the power flowed as long as it flowed. The pace of the energy transition doesn't really have much historical precedent. In January 2021, a majority of the EU's gas imports came from Russia. By October, that number was just a little bit over 10%. And at time of recording, well, it's now in single digits. As predicted 6 months ago, Russia's primary gas market largely disappeared. Unlikely, I would argue, to ever return to anything like its former glory. But perhaps it all would have been worth it for Russia if it had caused Europe to change course. If costs had become too high to bear and as a result people had demanded that some sort of rapprochement be made with Moscow, then maybe this just would have been a blip on the radar economically. It may even have left Russia on net in a better financial position as it had cashed in on the extremely high prices through the middle of 2022. But that's not how that story ended. Gas storages were filled ahead of schedule, and then much of Europe was treated to one of the most mild, warm, toasty winters in recent memory. It's often said that General Winter traditionally fights on the Russian side in war, but this time around the Europeans must have paid him a hefty amount to change sides. Temperature records across the continent were shattered over New Year's, and residents in Prague were forced into a double take when they realised that on New Year's Eve in the middle of winter, the daily temperature topped out at 17.7 degrees Celsius, 64 in American units. That's less freezing to death temperature and more the kind of level where the Brits will start breaking out shorts and t-shirts. Now, I don't want to pretend that this was all about the weather, although that absolutely helped. The failure of the energy war was primarily driven by a robust policy response, where European nations identified the measures that had to be taken and then found the money and political will to do it. From the Russian perspective, the damage to the European economies is likely at once to be somewhat uncertain, but also extraordinarily disappointing. Some impacts are easier to identify than others, like when France came up with a €45 billion fund in order to shield consumers from increasing energy prices. But in other respects, it's hard to separate the effects of the energy war from other global economic pressures. But whatever the drivers, the results were hardly apocalyptic. The end result of the concerted campaign to destroy the European economy was EU real GDP growth of 3.3% in 2022. That's growth beyond inflation. Growth in 2023, meanwhile, is expected to be largely stagnant. At 8.5%, inflation was uncomfortably high, but it is expected to come down to 6.1% in 2023, and moderate down to 3% in 2024. Unemployment actually hit a low in September, and government GDP deficits in 2022 were notably high at 3.4% of GDP and are expected to remain elevated, but at the same time, those figures were significantly lower than they were during other crises like the COVID era, and also lower than the federal deficits routinely seen in the United States. So as far as governments were concerned, the crisis was very expensive. But as a whole, the European Union has pretty broad financial shoulders. It was able to carry the weight. But perhaps even if the policy couldn't inflict enough damage on governments, it might be able to get at the people of the European Union. And so I pulled some statistics from late last year when gas prices were at their highest to see how the European population was responding. And on one hand, it's clear that people were definitely noticing. 46% of respondents had reported that their standards of living had been reduced, whether as a result of the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, or global economic disruptions. A further 39% said they hadn't felt the difference yet, but they expected to see it in the next year. In most countries, a clear majority of respondents also didn't think that their national governments were doing enough to deal with rising prices. In Estonia, that was feeling some of the worst inflation in the European Union, a massive 81% of respondents in October and November said the government wasn't doing enough. Keep that figure in mind because we'll come back to Estonia a little bit later on. And in southern and central Europe, where complaining about government is basically national tradition, numbers were similarly dire. But if you zoomed the question out and asked people how their lives were going as a whole, people remained very optimistic. When asked if they thought their lives were going in the right direction or the wrong direction, There wasn't a single respondent country where more people said wrong direction than right direction. In Germany, the ratio was close to 6-1. In protest-loving France, the ratio was 2.3-1. And I don't know what was going on in Luxembourg, but I'm now interested as to whether or not they'd let me in. Because there, more than 80% of the population said things were going pretty well, as compared to 7% that said they weren't. I wouldn't normally focus on statistics like this, but I bring them up for one particular reason here. People will often complain about particular issues. They will almost always complain about government. But if they're freezing to death and one step away from revolution, they usually won't be telling you that their life is going pretty well. And in the midst of an energy crisis, that was apparently a majority opinion. Jumping forward to the end of winter 2023, and it's clear the energy crisis isn't entirely over. Europe now faces the challenge of refilling its storages for next winter. But inflation, energy, and the economic situation are actually a fading, if still very serious concern for the European population. The Eurobarometer survey showed a steady decline in concern over rising prices, energy supply, and the economic situation. Instead, people seem to be increasingly concerned with immigration, public finances, and notably, the EU's influence in the world. So I think it's fair to chalk this one up as a loss for energy blackmail. But I wanted to highlight an element of this whole campaign that is commonly missed, because there are countries around the world that suffered horribly as a result of that energy war. Because remember, a lot of that Russian gas that was going into Europe was piped gas. It couldn't be turned into LNG and re-exported into the market. When it stopped going into Europe, a lot of it simply stopped being exported, and Europe reached out to LNG markets around the world to help make up the difference. In Europe, that manifested as a financial price because the continent took out its rather extensive checkbook and just paid what the asking price was in order to secure cargoes. But while gas prices are now at an 18-month low in Europe itself, the shock to the LNG markets through 2022 was very real. And that had significant consequences for poorer countries that didn't have the money to spare to buy up those cargoes. Countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka that are already under immense financial pressure face difficult choices of either further draining their foreign exchange reserves to pay for LNG cargoes, or in some cases, as happened to Pakistan and a number of other countries, bidding for cargoes and then just not securing any, leading to domestic shortfalls. In many ways, this mirrors the impact we'll see if Russia ever fails to renew the Ukrainian grain export deal. Europe and the United States are not going to run out of energy, and they're not going to starve. Those products are commodities. They can be purchased with cash, and those countries have a lot of cash. Instead, those who suffer the most when supply exits the market are those with the fewest financial resources, those who can't afford to pay inflated prices, and unfortunately often those who have few other options. Allowing the export of Ukrainian grain isn't going to make or break the lives of those in the European Union, but it might mean impoverishment or even death for those elsewhere in the world. So how would we summarise the economic impacts of the energy war against Europe? And I know I normally caveat my findings or hedge my bets, so hopefully it means something when I say this straight. If the goal of the energy war was to break the European economy, then it was a massive failure. The impacts on Europe were financially painful, but certainly not critical. The pace and scale of the continent's response has been impressive. And while there are still long-term economic concerns like the cost pressures on German industry and its global competitiveness, for example, the stats so far do seem to suggest that the economy is holding together. And as for the extended goal of breaking up public support for Ukraine and shattering the Western alliance, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Because first, I want to do something I hope I don't regret and talk quickly about the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines, and specifically about the claim that the United States and Norway were responsible. Now let me say this up front. Over the last 6 months, I've largely tried to stay out of the myth-busting game. And to be very clear, I do not know who destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. But what I'm pretty confident about is that this claim doesn't deserve the headlines it's getting. To give you the spark notes, which are just my personal opinion, recently we have seen politicians and media figures around the world pick up the story of this report that the US and the Norwegians were responsible for the Nord Stream bombing and demand an investigation or run with it or make accusations on its basis. What basis exactly, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you posed the question. The claim originates in a Substack article by an American journalist called Seymour Hersh. He sets out this incredible story that could be straight out of a Tom Clancy novel or a Bond film of this elaborate plan that resulted in the bombing of the pipeline, and as evidence for it, he cites, you guessed it, an anonymous source, which in journalistic terms is sometimes understandable, but also one step away from I made it the hell up. And while a writer's identity is usually not a reason to discount a story if the evidentiary base is strong, here the evidentiary base is basically zero. So who is Mr. Hersh and why did he put up a Substack article? Well, Seymour Hersh is an award-winning American journalist. In particular, he's famous for exposing US war crimes, the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, and also for some of his articles during the time of Watergate. But that's the better part of 50 years ago, and his recent work should be considered as context. For example, he expresses a pretty high opinion of Bashar al-Assad. His views on some particularly infamous events during that conflict directly contradict the findings of international investigators, without the sort of evidentiary basis you'd expect for making those claims. I bring that up because of the implication that as a US journalist, what he writes is probably going to be in line with America's policy view. Nothing really could be further from the truth. And then there's just the weird stuff in his article. For example, he says that Jens Stoltenberg, the current Secretary General of NATO, is an avowed anti-communist who's been cooperating with the CIA since the Vietnam War. Now, if that's the case, then the CIA has truly broadened its recruitment strategies, because Stoltenberg was still literally a child when the Vietnam War ended. Not just that, his sister was involved in a Marxist-Leninist group called Red Youth, and Stoltenberg himself participated in rallies out the front of the US Embassy in Oslo, protesting against some of the bombings that took place as part of the Vietnam War. But I'm sure that was all part of some CIA long con to use his communist credentials to somehow in the future become a reliable Secretary General of NATO. Heavy sarcasm intended. Now, I could go on. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the article that just doesn't make sense. But my main point is this. The information space right now is full of noise. And in that environment, more than ever, extraordinary claims should require extraordinary evidence. And while the fog of war may be very real, it should take more than a blog post, a single anonymous source, and a completely batshit claim in order to cause an international incident. Again, I don't know what happened with Nord Stream. I just don't think Seymour Hersh, who has been repeatedly interviewed by or written for Russia Today, knows either. So with that rebuttal out of the way, let's turn to the political considerations. Because economic damage to Europe was probably only a means to an end when it came to the energy war, the real goal, of course, of it and information warfare was likely to break up the Western alliance. Because, as I've argued in the past, as long as the Western powers continue to accelerate aid to Ukraine, then Russia is in an incredibly difficult position. And I won't bury the lead here. European opinion in support of Ukraine remains really strong. Specific divisive measures, like sending battle tanks from Germany into Ukraine, did have an impact on public opinion in some respects. There were some Germans, for example, that got nervous once the Leopards were freed. But the overall numbers are still decisive. 88% support for taking in Ukrainian refugees, 77% for extended financial support, and 65% for the EU stepping in and directly financing or supplying military equipment to Ukraine, which is a step beyond individual countries choosing to do so. At the same time, there's been some notable electoral successes for pro-NATO and pro-Ukraine candidates. We've already talked about the election of Petr Pavel in the Czech Republic, whose publicly stated opinion is that Ukraine should be given everything short of nuclear weapons. And then there's the re-election a couple of days ago of Estonia's pro-Ukraine Prime Minister. Prime Minister Kaja Kallas' victory is particularly notable because of the figures we talked about earlier. Estonia suffered terribly from inflation. A vast majority of Estonians didn't think that the government did enough in order to protect them from cost of living increases. So the economic damage component of the Russian plan clearly was there. But it didn't stop the election going in Kallas and by extension Ukraine and NATO's favour. It may well be that Estonians hated inflation, but hated Russian coercion more. I suspect we should all now be watching both the Bulgarian and Finnish elections that are coming up relatively soon to see if this pattern is repeated. And while we don't have recent country-by-country statistics, I've thrown some up on screen there from late last year that illustrate another point. Public opinion on the EU's support for Ukraine varies greatly country to country within the bloc. Some of the numbers are truly extraordinary, like 97% in Sweden and 95% in Finland. It's pretty rare in a democracy that you'd see 97% of people agree on anything. There are a lot of countries out there where if the government took a stance saying the Earth wasn't flat, there would inevitably be some political opponents who embraced flat Earth theory, simply on partisan grounds. But even in cases where numbers are lower, places like Bulgaria or Greece, things are often slightly more pro-Ukraine than stats make it appear. Mostly because 48% approval doesn't mean 52% disapproval, because there's always a percentage of respondents who say they have no opinion or do not answer the question. Jump forward to aggregated statistics from, I believe, February this year, and you can see how well Putin's charm offensive in the EU has gone. 78% of respondents say that by standing against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the EU is defending European values. 76% view Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a threat to the security of their country. 84% want to reduce dependence on Russian energy imports, and something like 68% think more should be spent on defence in the European Union. Now, to be clear, some of these numbers have moderated down from the start of the war, but I wouldn't call widespread public support for increased defence spending and EU-level defence cooperation a strategic win for Russia's energy war. Especially since in a lot of places in Europe, defence spending used to be basically a dirty word. Something either to be outsourced to other countries or simply not necessary at all. Now opinions have changed, and we'll see the industrial impact of that change a little later on in this presentation. But that's Europe. What about America? US opinion is a more mixed bag, but also I feel often not fairly reported. Because one of the most popular headlines you will see whenever a US opinion on the war in Ukraine is covered is the idea that US support for Ukraine has, quote, softened, or words to that effect. And looking at a range of polls, so AP, Gallup, and a number of others, that's certainly true. The number of Americans, for instance, who think the United States is currently providing too much financial and military assistance to Ukraine has definitely increased from the start of the war. To which one might glibly respond, yes, because American support has increased significantly from the start of the war. But another equally important way of framing this story is that this is still a largely bipartisan issue in the US with majority support. Looking at the overall US population, 30% said not enough was being done to support Ukraine, 28% said too much was being done, and 39% said it was just about right. Majorities supported more sanctions, taking in more refugees, and providing more weapons. But the nuance when analysing the US position, and I have to admit, Americans, this is kind of fascinating for an outsider to look at, is the increasing partisan split. The Republican Party is heavily divided, with about half saying too much aid is going, and the other half, still a slight majority in that Gallup poll, saying either that current aid is about right or not enough. Basically, it seems the Republican Party includes both those who would like to leave Ukraine largely to its own devices, but also some of those who still wish Ronald Reagan was around, and would like to see the arsenal of democracy ramp up to speed. Fascinatingly enough, however, according to another poll, very few Republicans trust Biden to respond effectively, which means the vast majority agree that they don't like Joe Biden, even if it's for completely different reasons. I don't bring this up to throw stones at the US political system. A lot of countries around the world suffer from political polarization or their own distinct political issues. I bring this up to highlight that there are very few bipartisan issues in the United States, and yet, statistically speaking, Ukraine is still one of those. There aren't many issues that'll get 60 or 70% of Americans voicing their support, acting on the dangerous assumption that most politicians would like to be re-elected, and that going against public opinion is usually not a very good way to be re-elected, although it obviously depends on your electorate and your base. For the moment at least, it seems like US support is holding. For completeness, I'll also include a quick aside on global opinion here, because it's important to remember the world isn't just the West plus Russia, and as Russian supporters will often point out, countries representing a majority of the Earth's population haven't actually sanctioned Russia. So where do those countries stand? Well, in the UN General Assembly, voting for an immediate Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, 141 countries voted in favour, 32 abstained, and 7 countries, including Russia, voted against the motions. As usual, Russia was joined by its superpower allies Nicaragua, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, Mali, and the Syrian Arab Republic. I also dug up some Ipsos polling that looked at 28 nations around the world, including some notably, quote, neutral states like India and South Africa, although I will note that South African arms companies are helping to supply Ukraine. And sure enough, that showed that the majority of the population surveyed in non-European Union states didn't support sending, for example, military equipment to Ukraine or imposing sanctions on Russia. Strangely enough, though, that survey series also showed a narrow increase in the surveyed population who would support sending troops into Ukraine. 27% of Americans were happy to send the Marines, 30% of the Dutch, 33% of people in the United Kingdom, and there was also a surprisingly bloodthirsty population in Canada and Australia. Then I found a truly weird result, and with it an opportunity to provide a warning on interpreting survey data. Because according to the Ipsos, the world's response to the war in Ukraine poll, the country with the greatest support for sending troops to Ukraine was India. Which is really strange because 66% of respondents wanted to maintain close diplomatic ties with Russia. Which means, statistically speaking, there must be a portion of respondents who wanted to maintain diplomatic ties with Russia, but also send in the troops. Now, how does that work? And as always, my warning would be, read the methodology, read the question, read the details of the survey sample. Now, on one hand, the sample did skew towards richer, more urban Indians, but I don't think that's what's at play here. Instead, I suspect the problem is the question. The question was, would you support the government if, and then insert action here in relation to the war in Ukraine? And then about 43% of respondents said support in response to basically everything, and 66% said yes in response to maintaining ties with Russia. And given the overlap between the responses, my working theory is that there is a portion of the Indian population, a not insignificant one for example, that will simply support whatever it is the government chooses to do. They may have a different opinion on what the government should do, but the question didn't ask what they thought the government should do, the question asked whether they would support the government if it did it. I can't prove that point, but America doesn't have a monopoly on partisan politics, and I mostly include this section as a warning against jumping to hasty conclusions based on apparently surprising survey data. I may not know how the war is going to progress over the next 6 months, but I would bet pretty heavily it is not going to end with a massive deployment of Indian troops throwing Russian forces out of Ukraine. To put that all together, Russia has failed to break Western public opinion and it's failed to break apart the Western alliance. There have been marginal moderations in Western opinions on support for Ukraine, but majority support is still very much there, and I'd be nervous about concluding that trends are going to continue forever. Winning the public relations war is going to remain critical. It may even be central to some Russian theories of victory. But if that's Russia's objective, well, there's a long way to go. But now it's time to turn this around and see how the US efforts to attack the Russian economy with sanctions have gone. Because while it's clear that Europe didn't freeze over the winter, it's also abundantly clear that the Russian economy is still alive and kicking. Western objectives seem to be pretty self-explanatory: to cause damage to the Russian economy and weaken its capacity to wage war. In order to do so, there were a raft of restrictions and sanctions we've talked about before: sanctions on the financial system, freezing of assets, restrictions on the export of technology into the Russian Federation, and an ever-expanding mirror of the Russian energy war. Russia tried to go after Europe's dependence on Russian gas. The Western Allies, meanwhile, tried to go after Russian revenues from oil and petroleum product exports. Import restrictions on Russian seaborne oil into the European Union were put into place, and then we saw price caps not just on crude oil but also recently on petroleum products as well. When I first covered this topic 6 months ago, there were those suggesting this would pretty quickly destroy the Russian economy, and those suggesting that commodified energy products just don't respond well to sanctions and there wouldn't be much effect. So now, after a year of war, where do things stand? The short, upfront answer is that it really depends. It depends on the product you're talking about and the measure you're choosing to use. Do you care about the quantity produced and exported? Do you care about the prices? Do you care about long-term prospects? Where do your priorities lie? To illustrate the point, consider pipeline gas from the Russian Federation that used to largely go to the European Union. Russia made tremendous windfall profits on those gas exports over 2022. Because the Europeans were still scrambling for alternative solutions like getting LNG imports stood up or putting in place additional energy generation, they were willing to pay basically any price the market demanded for as much gas as possible to fill their storages. And that meant gas prices got very, very high and profits rose with it. but total export volumes fell and are likely to remain depressed, because most of Russia's pipeline gas that was going to Europe can't really go anywhere else, at least not easily. Most fields don't have the pipelines to take them to other export customers, like to China. Nor is there the liquefaction capacity to convert that gas into LNG for shipping. With crude oil, meanwhile, well, the product is commodified. It can still travel. You put it on a ship and you sail it somewhere else. And so quantities aren't expected to decline by anything like the same volumes. There, instead, the question is price. But let's start with some key headline takeaways. There was a debate in 2022 as to whether Russia would be able to find new markets for its seaborne oil. Would it be able to find people who would buy it? Would it be able to find ships that would carry it? The answer so far has been very much yes. On one hand, the big new customers have been China and India, both of whom have massively ramped up their purchases of Russian crude. But then there's also a giant shell game to get Russia into other markets more or less regardless. The whole thing is sanctions busting 101 and really could make for a decent movie. At least if the entire film-going public suddenly had a thing for creative lawyering and watching slow-moving at-sea oil transfers. A third of Russian oil does still travel on European-owned ships, but more and more of it is being carried by grey ships and dark ships. A grey ship is what happens when a European shipper that can no longer carry Russian oil that's affected by a price cap or some other restriction simply sells its tanker to another company not based in Europe that wasn't active in the tanker business before, and that unencumbered company now takes the ship and carries oil. Now those ships are useful for your basic kind of tasks. Then there are the so-called dark ships, many of which are veterans of evading Western sanctions, and they're ships that are often owned or operated by countries like Iran or Venezuela. The reporting suggests they're less about creative lawyering to get around sanctions the same way other ships might be, and instead more about things like, turning off your transponder. Discussion of how Russia is still getting its crude exported could be a video of its own. There are all sorts of methods being used. Ships leaving ports but not listing a final destination for their cargo full of oil. Ships meeting up at sea and transferring oil at sea. Or you will have traders in countries take deliveries of Russian oil, mix it with non-Russian oil, turn it into a different product, and then re-export it. This is a gross oversimplification, but here's the core point. The Russians contend that oil production volumes and export volumes, both on net, increased in 2022. Through fair means or foul, the oil is getting out. But if you go back and read the material underpinning the European price cap and other sanctions materials, they'd all say that this is fine. In fact, this was kind of the intended result. As THRE Bossini of the International Energy Agency points out, the purpose of the price cap was to allow Russian oil to continue to flow to the market, but at the same time reduce Russian revenues. If all of Russia's oil exports actually ceased, yes, the Russian economy would implode, but the world wouldn't be in very good shape either. So the objective wasn't to knock down Russian export volume so much as it was to knock down the price. And in that respect, the Russians are being taken to the cleaners. Whether it's China, India, or these various middleman parties that collect oil and then blend it or re-export it, all of them know they have Russia over a barrel, pun intended. And so whereas Russia used to have to trade Urals oil at about a $5 discount against Brent crude, now $30 plus isn't even unusual. Now, there are some debates in the oil market over who captures that difference, whether it's always the purchaser or whether it's sometimes middlemen or shipping costs eating into that margin. But the Russian budget was put together presuming revenues of between $70 and $75 per barrel sold. Recently, they've been talking about getting $50. And given that figure's pretty close to the production plus shipping costs for some of Russia's oil deposits, you won't be surprised when I talk about the effect on the Russian budget a little bit later on. There's also another upcoming risk for Russian hydrocarbon exports that I'm not sure has been adequately highlighted. Russia doesn't just export raw crude oil, it also exports petroleum products, things like diesel fuel. Price caps and restrictions on the exports of those products only began in February, so it's still too early to see the impacts. But there is a possibility that by continuing to push its crude oil out, Russia is undermining its export potential for more advanced products. For example, India is buying discounted Russian crude oil. India is an oil importer, but it has a massive amount of refining capacity to convert crude oil into other products, which it can then re-export. I've received more than a few emails basically saying, hey, Perun, Russian oil is still going to make its way to European markets because the Indians are going to buy it, refine it into products, and then re-export it to Europe. That's not an outcome that's mutually exclusive with the EU and the US's objectives here, because all Russia is receiving in terms of profit is the discounted price of the original barrel. The person making all the money is India. And even better, India buying cheap oil and refining fuel products means India is now more able to compete with Russia's own exports of those refined products. It's a fact that goes partway towards explaining why Yale professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, when he was asked on DW about what the West should do about India's purchases of Russian oil, basically said that he wished they'd buy more. But most of that is narrative, and narrative is a dime a dozen unless it's backed by statistics. So let's have a look at what the impact on the Russian economy over the last year has been. Although in some ways that's a big ask because economic statistics are difficult at the easiest of times. And getting a consensus view on the status of the Russian economy right now is more difficult than ever. Russian data is now highly opaque. They simply don't publish most of the information they used to. Rostat's leadership has been changed several times, and I've talked before about the research done by individuals like Professor Sonnenfeld proving that a lot of what Russia does choose to publish is highly dubious. Now, the Russian argument for classifying a lot of this economic data is that it could hypothetically be used to assess the impact of sanctions and to better target them, which instantly raises a red flag because if the reason Russia is not choosing to publish statistics is because they might be used to assess the impact of sanctions, then it seems naive to suggest that what they are still choosing to publish can be reliably used to accurately gauge the impact of sanctions. And yet many of the statistics that have been put out there are often taken as given by commentators. I've even seen Russian figures work their way into debates, ostensibly as figures that came from Western sources. People might point to an quote-unquote IMF figure for the Russian economy and use it as evidence that everything is going fine. Now, there are statistics out there that paint a good picture, there are statistics out there that paint a bad picture, but my advice is always the same. Go to the original location, and I know this is boring, but read the methodology. A lot of times you may find that an organization is simply publishing statistics that have been given to it by a source like the Russian Federation. You should also check whether or not they're including the ostensibly annexed regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson in Russian estimates. And yet everything I say in the following section is going to be using Russian figures. That doesn't mean I think they're correct. There's a lot of good research out there to suggest they're very much not correct. But there's a point to be made here that stands up even if you just use Russian source material. There are a variety of Russian sources out there that are all pointing to the fact the Russian economy is likely to decline in terms of real GDP in 2023. A survey of Russian businesses estimated negative 2.1%, the Russian Central Bank estimates between negative 1 and negative 4%, and the Ministry of Internal Development estimates around negative 1%. Now, in response to foreign estimates of larger declines in 2023, the Russian Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, suggests that those estimates often don't take into account what he calls strategic measures that are being implemented. In other words, government stimulus and government intervention in the economy in order to hold it up. Now, the response, of course, is that yes, most estimates are going to take those measures into account as best they can. But it's also a very important point to put some context around this prediction of the economy declining. Because often national GDP doesn't decline during wartime. Often it increases. Because when the government opens the checkbook and decides that it wants to buy 1,000 new tanks yesterday, if possible, that's going to have a stimulatory effect. A tank that is built, shipped to Ukraine, and then destroyed by a Javelin missile is still GDP. And the need to replace it again isn't realised as a reduction in economic activity or GDP, it's realised as an impact on the budget. And according to the officially released Russian figures, the Russian budget isn't in a particularly good way. Russia set a deficit target for all of calendar year 2023 of 2.93 trillion rubles. By the end of February, it had spent 2.58 trillion of that. Oil and gas revenues were down 46.4% compared to the equivalent period in 2022. Overall revenue was down by about 25%, part of that due to declines in income tax. Spending jumped by about 51%, and the National Wealth Fund, basically one of Russia's rainy day funds, declined in value from about $155 billion to $147 billion over the course of a month. Now, there are a lot of moving parts with those figures, changes to tax and expenditure timing. Veterans of most organisations know what anarchy comes towards the end of financial year as everyone struggles to spend remaining budget before the FY ends. In Russia's case, most expenditure is traditionally weighted towards the end of the calendar year. They're saying they're trying to move more of that to the start in order to even things out a bit. But if you're telling me you've spent something like 80% of your allowable deficit, you're 2 months into the year and you're trying to fight a war, then either something likely has to change or you're probably going to sail right past your target. And there are signs that some changes might be on the horizon, mostly in the form of de facto gigantic tax increases. One form this can take is so-called one-off contributions by major companies like Gazprom. The company made massive profits when gas prices were high in 2022, and a lot of that money was harvested and handed over to the government. Now there's talk about changing the way that taxes on oil are calculated in Russia. Basically, instead of using the price of Russian blends like Urals in order to determine the taxes, the government's basically like, let's just use the price for Brent oil instead, which is considerably higher. Now, the government pretending the price of oil is higher doesn't magically make it so. All it means is the oil company has to hand over more money, which may, to be fair, help in the short term, but in the medium to long term, it's a serious issue. The Russian energy sector is actually in pretty desperate need of recapitalization. They lost access to technology and investment from the Western world as a result of sanctions, and they need to reinvest in order to open up more deposits, if they want their industry to be sustainable or cost competitive going forward. That's hard to do when you're taxed on profits that you didn't actually earn. And I imagine we're all hoping governments around the world don't discover that particular technique. There's also talk of doing things in sectors outside oil and gas. There's talk of a one-off budget contribution by businesses, reportedly, which would basically be a one-off wartime tax for certain businesses. And you see discussion about changing the calculation method for certain taxes. Again, I'm not generally a betting man, but if someone offered me the option to put money down to say that once those taxes are recalculated, they're not going to end up lower, I'd probably take it. And then when government talks about forcibly acquiring or forcing the sale of foreign-owned assets for a fraction of what they're actually worth, well, that may do something for the budget in the short term, but it also pushes long-term investor confidence out a 17th-story window. So I will concede there is uncertainty on how the Russian economy has fared over the winter and indeed over 2022 and early 2023. Like with most things to do with the war in Ukraine, there's actually a wide information spectrum, which I have imperfectly charted on the right there because I'll be using a lot later on when I talk about casualties and force generation in the future. But the key is there's a lot of different sources out there. And online, some of the loudest are actually more extreme than what the Ukrainian or Russian ministries put out. You might see pro-Ukraine channels that are far more optimistic than the Ukrainian government itself is. And on the Russian side, I consider a lot of what the Russian Ministry of Defense puts out to be complete and easily disprovable crap. But it is nothing compared to the material that you see from some of the pro-Russian foreign cheerleaders or disinformation efforts. On the topic for the Russian economy, for example, even if the Russian central bank comes out and says that times are tough and the economy is probably going to shrink, you'll still find those out there that say that Russia is booming economically and is in a stronger position than when it started. And they'll say it with complete confidence like it is the most obvious thing in the world. But the best evaluation I can make based on the available statistics is that the Russian economy and particularly the Russian budget are hurting. The effect is likely much less extreme than many in the West hoped for, and it's also taken longer for the effects to start being seen. But the impact on the budget and the economy is very clearly there. Russia has gone from strong expected growth to economic decline, and the budget has swung from strong surplus towards deep deficit. But my warning, and I've talked about this before, is that none of this is likely to be significant or lethal to the Russian war effort in the near future. There's plenty Russia can do to hold the economy up and to patch the budget. The key I'd focus instead on is how well Russia goes with mobilizing its economy for the purpose of war production. Because having money only matters if you can convert it into combat power. Private Conscriptovich probably doesn't care about how many rubles are in the National Wealth Fund. He cares about whether he has body armor, ammo, and something to eat. And so we'll look at military mobilization in just a bit. Because first I wanted to give an update on Russia's strategic bombing campaign targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And I know there are probably those out there saying, hey Perun, this probably belongs in the episode about battles. But given I'd argue the primary purpose of the attacks is to damage Ukrainian will and the Ukrainian economy, I feel like the topic does belong better here. In short, Russia's attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure accelerated greatly under the former commander of the operation in Ukraine, General Surovikin. The attacks reached a particularly high tempo in the closing months of 2022, October, November, December. With the switch over to Gerasimov's command, we have seen some changes in the Russian approach, but also some continuity. The frequency of the attacks has dropped, but the targeting has remained broadly similar. Now, one of the great fears back in November and December was that this campaign might plunge Ukraine into darkness during the cold of the winter months. With temperatures below freezing, a complete collapse of the electricity grid would have been catastrophic. But could have doesn't win any medals. I could have chosen to study something that makes for a fun conversation topic at parties. Defense economics doesn't exactly make good stand-up material. Vladimir Putin could have chosen not to invade Ukraine, but he did. And the Russians could have knocked out the Ukrainian power grid over winter, but they didn't. That's not to say the Ukrainian power grid didn't suffer extensive damage. There were estimates towards the end of last year that 40% of the grid had suffered some degree of damage. But the work of the repair crews and the efforts to rebuild, rebalance, and maintain the network have been phenomenal. The Ukrainians got better at hardening the grid. That meant quite literally putting up fortifications in order to protect some locations and transformers from Shahed attacks, but also getting better at shutting down parts of the grid, managing loads, and preventing excessive damage as a result of strikes. Energy restrictions remained a reality, but by the beginning of March, the grid as a whole was generally more stable than it had been in November or December. To put some figures around it, there's an internet connectivity measure for Ukraine after the most recent missile attacks, the largest in some time. Internet devices are not magic, they require electricity, and after the attacks, connectivity dropped by about 25%. But before even a day had passed, connectivity had already recovered to 91%. But I'm sure knocking 25% of the Ukrainian population off steam for 12 hours was absolutely worth the expenditure of multi-million-dollar hypersonic weapons. Back in December, where the situation was at nearly its most dire, there were some estimates done by Semyon Dyankov of the London School of Economics. They used a variety of economic data sets from Ukraine in order to estimate the scale of the power blackouts and the impact on economic activity. Their findings were that the attacks in September and October caused relatively short and limited disruptions. The 10 October raid, for example, caused a 10% loss of productive hours on the day that it arrived, but by day +4, everything was basically back to normal. What they did find, however, was the attacks had a compounding effect. Because the attacks at this point were coming every 1 to 2 weeks, there wasn't enough time to address and control for all the damage, and so the impact increased with each successive raid. Most of you will remember the 23rd of November raid and how it knocked out power across a significant part of Ukraine, at least for a while. But the impact on the economy in November, as they assess it, wasn't exactly ruinous. Power was available during 10% fewer productive hours. Sales at cafes per point of sale went down by about 10%, and imports of power generators massively increased. But single-digit percentage declines in certain points of economic activity does not a successful campaign make. Now, one thing I'll add to those statistics is they do not cost in the quality of life factor, or the increased costs that individuals have to bear. It doesn't take into account the fact that business had to pay to run backup generators. It doesn't take into account the stress of workers who had to work all sorts of weird and wonderful hours in order to take advantage of power when it was on. And it doesn't capture the misery of cities and towns being cut off from a regular supply of drinking water or power for days or weeks at a time. But while it's relatively limited data, it hardly looks like an economic knockout blow. The campaign also still places a strain on Ukraine's air defences. Significant numbers of new air defence systems have been pledged to Ukraine, but not all of them have arrived and gone into service yet. The missile attacks also have forced Ukraine to pull some of its air defences back from the front in order to defend its cities. And some Russian weapons, like S-300 or their hypersonics, have proven very, very difficult for Ukraine's ground-based air defences to intercept. Depletion of Ukraine's GBAD assets remains a critical threat, and Ukraine is going to need both more launchers, more radars, and more missiles in order to defend itself. But at the same time, the depletion of Russian missile systems is an issue as well. Attacks have slowed closer to the rate of what Russian factories can resupply. And hundreds of missiles fired against civilian energy infrastructure are hundreds of missiles that haven't been used to engage critical military targets. So how has the Russian strategic bombing campaign gone overall? Well, I'd argue that so far it's been an abysmal failure, but that doesn't mean it isn't a real threat and won't continue. Ukrainian willpower obviously hasn't broken, and the Ukrainian economy obviously hasn't collapsed. And while damage to the grid might compound over time, the Ukrainians have worked miracles, and foreign suppliers are also working miracles to facilitate repairs. Many countries have gone to relatively extreme lengths in order to get Ukraine replacement critical equipment like transformers. Hitachi Energy, for example, completely rejigged its existing production and delivery schedule to move Ukraine's requirements to the top of the list. A list of countries that provided Ukraine transformers is too long to go through, but it includes places like Azerbaijan and Croatia. One problem the Russian campaign faces is that if it takes too long to knock out the Ukrainian power grid, well, then there begins to be time for long lead time items, things that take 6 or 12 months to produce and supply, to begin arriving. Blowing up transformers with cruise missiles just isn't a good deal if your opponent has a decent supply of replacements available. And so I'd say the campaign is a going concern. So far, the Russian expenditure in munitions far outweighs the value of the results they've accomplished. But each new strike brings new risks, and the ultimate result remains very contingent. And so we come to the last part of this update, the question of military production. Because one thing that's become very clear in this war is that it consumes materiel, like so many wars before it, at an incredible rate. And how the war progresses is likely to owe a lot to how well the various countries involved are able to produce all the material needed to fight it. And I want to quickly talk first about the Ukrainian defense industry because I don't often see the topic covered. The Ukrainian defense sector has had to face a lot of challenges. Pre-war, it wasn't particularly well funded, its factories have had to disperse, some have been destroyed, and it's had to adapt to wartime conditions. I'm sure my Ukrainian listeners would forgive me if I went into some of the horrific mess that was contracting and production in the pre-war Ukrainian defense sector, but in the interest of time, I'll stick to the present day. Perhaps unsurprisingly, being invaded has had a motivational impact on the Ukrainian defense sector. Money has flowed in from the West, and some adaptations have been made. One example is that Ukraine is now producing domestically its own 152 and 122mm Soviet caliber shells. The problem, based on the best estimates I can find, however, is the quantity. A few thousand shells a month will help and production will expand, but it's unlikely to move the needle on a conflict at this scale. Perhaps more significant, as recently reported by Michael Kaufman, is that the Ukrainians are proving increasingly capable of maintaining and repairing a lot of the Western equipment that they're being sent. Obviously, the option remains available to send equipment to Poland, Lithuania, Germany, or the Czech Republic for repairs, but that takes time. And the Ukrainians are Slavs from a former communist country, which means being able to repair things when they break down is basically a genetically ingrained survival skill. And so I wouldn't be too quick to write off the contributions that Ukrainian industry can make, not just in the area of repairs, but two other critical respects. The first is in areas of comparative advantage, where Ukraine is genuinely pretty damn good at building a particular product. Probably the best example we've seen here is Ukraine's homegrown drone industry, where you haven't just seen innovation and workshops popping up all around the country, you've also seen foreign companies increasingly interested in partnering with Ukrainian talent and facilities. Ukraine's gotten pretty good, for example, at producing first-person suicide drones costing as little as a few $100s, which is horrifying for the future of war in general, but probably pretty useful in the near-term war effort. The other thing Ukraine can do is to try and produce munitions that fill desperate requirements that its Western partners aren't willing to fill. For example, Ukraine has been begging for some time for longer-range munitions than the Gimler's rockets for HIMARS. And yet, despite a push from Congress, Washington still hasn't agreed to send ATACMS missiles. And so it seems the Ukrainian defense industry is trying to squeeze out at least limited numbers of its own long-range weapon systems. These systems were either experimental or produced only in small quantities before the war. The Ukrainian Vilka MLRS system, for example, is based on the Soviet BM-30, but the M-type rockets have a range of 130 kilometers and GPS guidance, and the Ukrainians have admitted to using the weapon in combat. The issue, just as with much of the Russians' guided MLRS options, is that the quantity just wasn't there pre-war, and there's a question mark over wartime production. The Ukrainians were also developing their own TBM system, a system which operates in the same category as ATACMS. That could have a significant impact if deployed in any reasonable quantity, and no one's going to say the Ukrainians can't use their own weapons to strike Russian targets. But if Ukraine is managing production of those systems, then it remains a closely guarded secret. One imagines the West could hypothetically provide engineering advice and components to help get production off the ground. You could argue it's only fair given the number of Western components that have surfaced in Russian weapon systems, but so far there's no concrete evidence of anything like that happening. I also think it's just important in general to remain realistic about what Ukrainian industry can likely accomplish. One story that made the rounds recently, for example, was a claim that Rheinmetall was looking into building a tank factory in Ukraine. And this wasn't just going to be any tank factory. This was going to be a tank factory that cost only 200 million euros to build, that would have its own air defences, would build up to 400 tanks per year, and those tanks, in a country which has never built NATO standard tanks before, would be KF-51 Panthers, which is Rheinmetall's next-generation cutting-edge prototype tank with a 130mm gun. Now, I do not want to sound overly dismissive, but I like to think I've got a bit of a finger on the pulse when it comes to global arms production and sales. And make no mistake, Rheinmetall are one of the giants of the sector. But if they can build an integrated air defense system capable of resisting hypersonic missile attack, as well as a factory, a new workforce to stand up mass production of a next-generation armoured vehicle, well then they are never going to lose another major contract again. Because if that cost estimate is all-inclusive, then Rheinmetall has basically discovered magic. And while I would never put the seemingly impossible past them, I do worry that a focus on blue skies ideas like this take away from more practical, lower risk and more immediate ideas on how to mobilise the Ukrainian war economy. Instead, realistically, most of Ukraine's war supplies are going to have to come abroad, and so production in the West is important to keep an eye on. Russia emphasises the role played by Western military aid. "We're fighting all of NATO" is a pretty common refrain. The reality is that NATO aid across the bloc remains a relatively small proportion of GDP, but it is admittedly vital. Over the winter, we have seen some encouraging changes. The pipeline of supply for Ukraine, for example, now includes a variety of new systems that will be going into production. Ground-launched small-diameter bomb is one example. There are also a number of forward orders for ammunition and resupply that again have gone into the pipeline. These are situations where Ukraine hasn't been given material directly from existing NATO stocks, but instead has been given funding to place orders with Western military providers to produce new equipment and particularly ammunition for them. But in other respects, the effort still falls far short of its overarching potential. For one thing, there's a big difference between industrial capacity, industrial potential, and actual order volume. There's what your factories can produce now, there's what your factories could produce if they were scaled up, and there's what they've actually been paid to produce. And as of February, we were still seeing major defence firms, particularly in Europe, complaining that while the demand, the need was clearly there, actual signed orders and funding often weren't. Not necessarily because of a lack of political will, but rather because bureaucracies and political and procurement systems simply weren't configured for wartime emergency production. Now, there have already been some significant gains in Europe, don't let me take away from that. The French have reportedly, for example, tripled the rate of production for the Caesar self-propelled gun. And some ammunition producers have already significantly ramped up production, particularly those in the Czech Republic and through much of the former Warsaw Pact. If you're producing Soviet-caliber artillery ammunition in Eastern Europe at the moment, it is basically a license to print money. But the important thing to watch is a number of measures that are coming through the European Union to increase artillery ammo production and procurement. There's a proposal, for example, to use about €1 billion of the European Peace Facility to pay for countries to send their stockpiles of ammunition to Ukraine and immediately reorder replacements. There's another proposal that has come primarily, I believe, from the French to basically give the Ukrainians a pot of money, again, probably about €1 billion, and then basically have the Ukrainians go to European ammunition producers and order what they need using that money. Finally, there is a particularly ambitious plan that has come out of Estonia for a €4 billion fund to provide the Ukrainians with 1 million artillery shells, according to some reporting, within the next 6 months. At the moment, reporting seems to suggest that the most likely outcome in the short term is a €2 billion program split evenly between providing Ukraine additional ammunition from existing stockpiles and funding future purchases. But in terms of things that would have a material impact on Ukraine's combat power, Getting them additional artillery ammunition this year and ramping up European production is pretty close to the top of that list. America appears to be racing ahead, at least when it comes to artillery ammunition production. America doesn't have the artillery shell production capacity that the Europeans or the Asia Pacific does. But what it has done is secure the money and the funding to get production ramping happening, and it did it last year. Production should be hitting around 20,000 155mm shells per month around now. And Doug Bush, who, if I remember his title correctly, is the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisitions, Logistics and Technology, is talking about getting that towards 70,000 per month over the next 12 to 18 months. I imagine the increase won't be straight line growth, but you see the ambition there. The restriction on US expansion efforts has usually been the machine tooling as opposed to raw materials. As Bush puts it, these are machines the size of buildings. You don't just go buy it from a parking lot somewhere. The Americans are setting up new plants. There's going to be one in Garland, Texas. They're expanding some of their other facilities. And obviously Scranton is seeing a massive increase in production rate. And it's not just shells that are being ramped up. Gimler's production is going to be up by 33% this year to around 10,000 rockets per year. I'm not sure Ukraine would say no to another 10,000 Gimler's rounds. There's the establishment of GLSDB production, which will happen this year, and there's been a 100% planned increase in Javelin production. These changes cannot meet all of Ukraine's requirements. European and APAC productive capacity is necessary to do that. But it's clear the Americans are, at the very least, making significant progress. The other problem that the West faces isn't related to production at all, but rather to allocation and priority. Between stockpiles, production capacity in Europe, the United States, and the Asia Pacific, the capacity is there to meet Ukrainian requirements for just about everything, including artillery ammunition, but also things like infantry fighting vehicles, precision-guided missiles, and long-range ordnance. It's even probably possible to meet the Ukrainian stretch goals. Reznikov asked for 375,000 rounds of artillery ammunition per month, a rate of supply that would roughly double Ukraine's current rate of fire and get them pretty close to artillery parity with the Russian Federation. But that would require throwing basically everything at the problem. And whether you're talking about public statements or industry scuttlebutt, it's clear that a lot of capacity in the sector is already contracted, in some cases for years in advance. Nations have been made nervous by this whole experience. They want to rebuild their own ammunition stockpiles. And so the question is, are they willing to wait and put Ukraine first in the production queue? Is preparing for a potential future war more important than fighting one that exists now? The American Abrams tanks that are going to Ukraine are a good example of this. The Lima tank plant that is building these tanks has other M1 Abrams vehicles on order. It's not clear yet whether any of those orders will be downgraded in terms of priority in order to get Ukraine its tanks faster. And so in judging Western industrial mobilisation, I kind of want to give three answers. Depending on whether you're talking about potential, the speed of getting orders, euros and dollars into the hands of industry, or the speed of industry responding once the dollars are in hand. The potential of the Western defence industrial base is there. The financial firepower to make this happen is also there. What is required is a political drive to get orders signed and to prioritise production for Ukrainian requirements. So watch this space. And then finally, there's the elephant in the room, Russia's war production efforts. Because with Russian finances intact for now, and with mobilisation available to fill the ranks, I've often seen it suggested that Russia is likely to run out of quality military equipment long before it runs out of manpower or cash. And it's important to not write the Russian defence industrial base off just because the Russian economy as a whole is relatively small. This is a country with a very significant defence sector. The defence industry workforce as a whole is literally millions of people. So just because Russia's economy is equivalent in size to something like Italy in terms of nominal GDP, that doesn't mean it has Italy's productive capacity when it comes to military equipment. And within that wider Russian defence industrial base, there does appear to be some slack capacity. Often not modernised, often suited for working with older equipment, but it is there. We've seen this with things like tank repair facilities being reactivated in order to modernise old T-62s. And because, as the chieftain would put it, a bad tank is better than no tank, those who suggest time is on Russia's side in strategic terms often point to the idea that Russian defence industry can if not producing the best weapons, certainly outproduce a lot of what is opposing it. Prigozhin, for example, recently claimed, I believe, that Russia will soon hit World War II levels of artillery ammunition production. Press X to doubt. Because just as it's important to remember that Russia has a more militarized industrial base than many countries in the West, it's also important to remember that its defense industry wasn't actually in great shape before the war broke out, and that many of the challenges that Western companies face in expanding production are also issues for Russia as well. On one hand, Russia definitely moved more quickly in terms of moving their industry over to a war footing. But there are challenges with the availability of labour and also of capital. Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov said that the industry was facing a shortage of about 400,000 workers in the middle of last year, 120,000 of those being highly skilled. And that was before Russia declared partial mobilisation, leading to many qualified individuals and workers leaving the country. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has claimed the Russian defense industry is considering employing prison labour, presumably drafted from those who haven't already been drafted into Wagner, though I'm not sure how much credence I put into that particular report. But it's not just labour, it's also capital. The industry was highly indebted before the war broke out. The government had to keep bailing it out, but at the same time a lot of the profits were coming from foreign sales because the government would drive a very hard bargain on equipment that it procured. One explanation the Russian government has advanced as to why the budget blew out in January is because they're front-loading purchases of military equipment they're paying in advance. And I presume they have to pay in advance because in many cases the defence industry won't have a massive pool of liquidity to begin production without the funds arriving up front. And that leads into one of the stranger observations I'm going to make about the Russian budget, and that is that despite the massive blowout, defence spending isn't actually that high. Ordinarily, during a major war, defence spending skyrockets. I've got a graph there, very approximate in the bottom right-hand corner, where you can see what happened to UK and US defence spending before and during World War II. And you can see again what happened during the Korean conflict, quite a significant jump. Russian national defence spending officially was about 3.6 trillion rubles in 2021 before the war broke out. In 2023, it's officially budgeted to be about 5 trillion. That's an increase, but certainly not what you'd expect of a wartime increase. And in terms of increases over 2022 and 2021, it's nothing compared to the increase in the national security budget. There's plenty of cash there for internal security, for Rosgvardia, for the spy agencies, and for law enforcement. But the official defense budget looks more like a peacetime build-up than a wartime emergency. If those figures are accurate, then it suggests that the only thing the Russian government fears more than the Ukrainians are the Russians. And if industry can only afford to produce where cash is provided up front, well, where's the cash for any sort of massive Russian military buildup? There's secret expenditure too, to be sure, but that can only go so far, because there's still seemingly money in the budget for incredibly expensive blingy systems that have no bearing on the conflict in Ukraine itself. Both Russian public statements and released US intelligence evaluations suggest that Russia is still pouring funds into nuclear modernization, platforms and delivery systems as a priority. And assuming the laws of physics work the same in Russia as in any other country, nuclear modernization is expensive. And that's before you factor in the issues of sanctions, inflations, and also just general wartime expenses. I've seen it suggested that sanctions haven't stopped the Russians from producing military equipment. That's very true. Where we see shortages of critical components, for example, instead it looks like Russia will produce simplified platforms, tanks that have downgraded optics or thermal sights because they can't get the imported components, but they're still able to produce the basic tank, right? And in other cases, they're still able to get truly necessary components in order to keep production running. But the thing about sanctions is that even if they don't prevent you getting something, they certainly make it more expensive. After all, the seller now knows that you're desperate and they're taking risk. It has to go through an intermediary country or whatever other sanction-busting technique that you're using. There are delays, there are middlemen, and there are costs. And then there's the issue of inflation. This has affected countries around the world, but it's impacted Russia too. The price of artillery shells in the West has increased significantly. The cost of doing business in the defense sector is inflating rapidly. But the Russian defense budgets I showed you before are not inflation adjusted, they're in nominal terms. which means there's a race between realizing additional economies of scale in order to get savings, but also fighting inflationary pressure, both from sanctions but also just the general economic environment. So once you take account of all of the costs of actually, fighting a war, paying combat allowances, feeding, supporting, and sustaining forces in the field, even if some of those costs are outsourced to local governments or third parties, the cost is still going to be there. I want there to be more study into whether or not the Russian budget actually has room to support some of the very high estimates of Russian production increases that have been thrown out there. Now, there is evidence of efforts to ramp up production in various areas. I've previously shown articles from Russian media and shared intelligence estimates from Western parties. There is, however, immense variability in those estimates. One that's in open source that I can share here was put out by The Economist recently, and it had to do with tank production. They suggest that Russia is currently producing around 20 brand new tank hulls per month. That is primarily going to be very modern kit like T90M. Then there's the number of refurbishments where they take an existing hull, they upgrade it or restore it, and then put it into service. This, The Economist estimates at about 25 per month currently, working towards a goal of 90 per month relatively soon. I have my own thoughts on those numbers, but let's use them for the moment. Annualizing visually confirmed Russian tank losses gives a rate of a bit under 150 per month, which tells the tale of production expanding, but not enough to meet the present requirements. And looking across the various items that the Russian army consumes and that Russian industry produces, tanks are one of those items that are arguably in better shape. The number of reserve vehicles is comparatively high, and the production capacity relative to losses is also pretty decent compared to other types of systems. Russian media have carried stories suggesting the efforts to put older equipment like BMP-2 or BMP-1 back into production are basically not worth it, too difficult relative to the cost. What they can do is try and scale instead production of things like BMP-3, but that's a vehicle that had a maximum pre-war rate production estimate of about 250 vehicles per year. And I don't see how you ramp that up by the necessary factor of 5, 6, 7, or 8, given Russian budget constraints, workforce constraints, and capital constraints. Now, I will highlight here there is uncertainty and there are competing estimates. On the 7th of December last year, for example, Russian TV claimed that a new batch of 200 T90M main battle tanks had been delivered, and not to the Russian army, or at least the Russian army proper, but instead to the forces of the Luhansk People's Republic. Now, that claim obviously raises significant questions, namely, who paid for the tanks, who built them, and where? Why haven't we subsequently seen LNR units using them in large numbers? And why on earth would units like that get T90M at a time where some top-rate Russian formations are getting much older technology? But hey, perhaps I'll be proven wrong, and within a few months, most active Russian tanks in Ukraine will be T90M. My point is not to write off the capacity of the Russian defense industry. Instead, it's to highlight that it faces some of the same barriers and concerns that producers elsewhere also have to deal with. And at the same time, it also faces rapidly escalating demands. The challenges facing the Russian defense industrial base are more than just producing enough equipment to counter the visually confirmed losses that we see. It's not a case that Russia loses 100 tanks blown up by artillery or javelins, and as a result, the defense industry needs to turn out 100 new tanks. Everything in war depreciates and attrits. Even a tank that isn't destroyed has a lifespan and is eventually going to need an overhaul. A barrel with a lifespan of 1,000 rounds needs to be replaced after that 1,000 rounds. An engine only has so many life hours. Vehicles that aren't destroyed need overhaul, and they need far more spare parts during wartime than they would during peace. So the factories have to do that overhaul, and they have to provide those spare parts, while also producing new vehicles. Oh, and they have to do repair duty on vehicles that have been badly damaged, and also these are probably the same factories and staff and resources that are being used to overhaul, repair, and refurbish vehicles that are being pulled out of storage yards. Once you exhaust the vehicles that are already in operational condition, once you actually have to do restoration and upgrade work, well, guess, once again, it's the same DIB that has to do it. This is something where NATO countries have been providing a critical service to Ukraine. Not reporting new equipment donations, but instead repairing and refurbishing equipment that Ukraine sends back to them. Russia has to do that too. And with only so much in the way of funding, factory space, and staff, plus the crushing constraints imposed by the linear passage of time, I'd submit there's plenty of good reasons to not expect Russia to see dramatic increases in new builds of critical systems. But that's a topic we'll pick up again in the coming weeks. In conclusion, at an economic and political level, all sides went into the winter with certain objectives. The Russian energy campaign in the effort to break apart the Western alliance appears to have largely failed, as has their campaign for now against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. By contrast, Western sanctions certainly haven't collapsed the Russian economy, although Russian budget and export figures certainly suggest that not all is well in Moscow. Finally, mobilisation for war production is a very mixed picture. Both Ukraine and the Western powers have reasons for optimism, but it's also clear the full productive potential of the bloc hasn't yet been mobilised and directed. Russia, meanwhile, is clearly proceeding with more urgency, but by its own admission faces constraints in terms of labour and capital. All of that is significant to the issues of attrition and force regeneration, which is a topic I will pick up in the coming weeks. Okay, channel update to close out, and it's been 6 months since I did a proper update on this side of the conflict, so I thought it was time to do one. The original intention for this video was to be holistic, to look at both the economic political side of the war and also to look at the battlefield as well. But I had some last minute reasons for splitting the video in two, and as a result I was able to expand out this one, and we'll do the other one in the coming weeks. I'm not sure whether next week's video will be that video or hypersonics. I might put up a poll to determine which one is of greater interest. And I'm also aware the poor Perun gaming channel has been suffering for some time, and I'd like to give it some videos this week. If for no other reason than because it's been a hectic month and I could use a quick gaming break. I do hope that you found this video informative, and that you're looking forward to some of the upcoming topics. Thank you as always for your ongoing support, and I'll see you all next week.